Jinx. Jinx. You're a Jinx. Vi's last words echoed in Powder's mind. She awoke with a groggy head and blurry eyes. The first thing she noticed was the unfamiliar smell. It was too clean, too chemical, and she did not like it. One by one, her senses revealed her surroundings. The softest bed she had ever felt. The drum of heavy footsteps outside the room she was in, and the room itself. It was filled with boxes and shelves. The walls were bare. Pipes and rafters crisscrossed the ceiling only a few meters above her head. There was a knock at the door, and the knocker did not wait for a response. The steel door swung open with a whine, and Powder sprung up as a silhouette stood out against the light behind the doorway. She noticed a pipe just above her head, leapt up and grabbed it, pulling herself up and onto a wooden beam next to the pipe. She sunk into stillness and silence. "It's okay," said a slimy voice. "You can come down. I won't hurt you." As her eyes adjusted to the light, Powder saw that it was Silco, the man who had taken her from the warehouse. His amber eyes shone. "Won't hurt me? You drugged me!" Powder cried. Silco stepped into the room. Powder tensed up and bared her teeth. He stopped and spread his arms, as if to show he meant no harm. "I gave you something to calm you," he replied. "You were very upset and clearly exhausted. You needed rest." "Why should I trust you?" Powder asked. "Vander always said you're a bad man." Silco sighed. "Vander was brave, and he cared deeply for you. But he was not perfect. Do you know, he and I were once like brothers. But he betrayed me." "You betrayed him!" Powder screamed, as she launched herself off the beam and dove at him. For a split second, he tensed up and raised his arms, then let out a brief sigh and relaxed. Powder sent her fists and feet into his face, his torso, any part of him she could reach. He stood and took it, moving with the blows. She continued punching and kicking as tears began to flow. Soon she was panting, and the attack gradually subsided into an angry pounding on his chest. He took her shoulders and pulled her in close, holding her as Vander always did, like a father holds his daughter. The pounding stopped and she broke into sobs. She left me," Powder said between heaving breaths. "She called me a Jinx." For a while Silco said nothing, he simply held her. When her breathing slowed, he knelt down and looked into her eyes. "Your sister was wrong to leave you," he said. "She did not see what I see. I brought you here because you are special, little one. You can do more than you know. Your family did not believe in you." Powder lowered her head. Silco took her chin gently in his hand and raised it up, so their eyes met once again. "I do." She studied his broken face with its scars and thought she saw something real. But no, she should not trust so easily. What would Vi do, she thought. Then she remembered what Vi had done and her face hardened. "Why should I believe you?" she asked. He stood up and backed away, standing beside the open door and holding his arm towards the exit. "I am not keeping you here by force, little one. You are free to leave whenever you please." He strode forward, dropped to one knee and placed his hands on her shoulders. "But if you stay, I can help you become strong. You will have everything you need here. You will never suffer again. I will take care of you." Powder was very alone. This man was offering her a home. She placed her arms around his neck and hugged him. She did not see him smile sadistically behind her. "I want a new room," she said. His smile widened. Silco led Powder by the hand towards a gaping, perfectly round hole in the ground. It was so wide she could only just see the other side, and it was topped by what looked like a giant fan. The fan's tips were a meter from the hole's edge, and Silco guided her towards one blade which bridged the gap with loose wooden planks. Powder hesitated for a moment. "Don't be afraid," said Silco. "I'm here." His eye glinted as he turned to her. He released her hand and strode across the boards onto the fan blade. "See? It's perfectly safe." Powder gulped and stepped onto the wood. It creaked. She ran across and leapt into his arms. He chuckled as he caught her. "Well," he said, "we're here. Your new room." He waved his hand towards the center of the fan, where a bundle of blankets and mismatched pillows lined the floor. Against the fan's center was a steel worktop, covered with screws, tools, and twisted pieces of metal. "I understand you're somewhat of a tinker," he continued. "Feel free to tinker as much as you'd like. Nobody will disturb you." Powder did not know what to say. Why was this man being so nice to her? He wanted something, but what? "Thanks," she muttered finally. He smiled. "You are most welcome." He patted her shoulder. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we will begin your training." Powder's head snapped towards him. "Training for what?" she asked. "Why, to become one of us," he replied. "To help bring about the future." Powder's dreams were haunted that night. The faces of the ones whose deaths were her fault, Milo, Clagor, Vanda, revealed themselves and whispered to her. All they said was Jinx over and over. She awoke suddenly and screamed. The giant space echoed the noise back to her until 100 Powders were crying in unison. Then she heard a different noise. "It's not a bad thing, you know." Powder scrambled up and lowered herself into a fighting stance. "Who said that?" "It's not a bad thing to be a Jinx. Depends what we do with it." Powder swung her gaze from left to right. There was no one there. She was alone. She needed more information. "What do you mean?" she said to the air. "Well, the gang said we brought bad luck, right? What if we just take that bad luck and aim it at the people who would hurt us?" The voice sounded familiar. "Vi?" she whispered. The mystery voice screeched. "Don't say that name. You don't like her anymore. You don't need her." "What?" Powder mumbled. She looked around again. When the truth hit her, her legs buckled and she sank down onto the blankets. The voice was inside her head. "Oh God, what's happening? Am I crazy?" The voice ignored the question, instead replying, "They were mean to you, called you a Jinx. You'll show them a Jinx." Powder's head span. Fluorescent pink and blue light swam across her vision. The voice grew louder, but it no longer said words. It just laughed, a mad, manic laugh. It reached such a pitch that she was afraid her eardrums would burst. She passed out. It felt to Powder like only a minute had passed before she was being shaken awake. A man she did not recognize was leaning over her. She snapped at his hand with her teeth and he backed away, his face betraying minor annoyance. Powder turned away, embarrassed. She did not know she was capable of such behavior. "Get up," said the man. He was dressed in various shades of grey and brown, with most of his body covered by thick garments and loose leather armor. "The master's waiting for you." "The master? You mean Silco?" The man turned and made his way along the blade without answering. "Are you real?" Powder shouted after him as she ran to catch up. He ignored her again, but she thought she heard him mutter, "Crazy girl." Powder collapsed onto the floor for what felt like the 100th time. Her trainer, Sevika, was not holding back, and Powder already had bruises and cuts on every part of her body. She had not even been able to land one punch on the powerful lady. She tried to push herself up, but her arms were too weak, and she slumped back down. "Get up, little girl," Sevika snarled. Powder glared at her through her blue fringe. Sevika saw the glare and laughed. "The little pup has anger, but she won't use it." "She's weak," she added, turning to Silco. Powder did not have the strength to argue. She rested her face against the cool, hard floor and gasped for breath. Silco strode over to her. "She's right, you know," he said. "You are not using your rage. If you can unleash it, it will give you power." Powder turned her eyes to him. "But Vanda always said—" "Vanda," Silco interrupted, "is gone. If you want to become strong like Sevika, like us," he waved his hand around the room at the goons watching the exchange, "you must learn our ways. Now come." He gently held her arm and pulled her to her feet, then leaned down until his lips brushed her hair. "Imagine Sevika is your enemy," he whispered. "Imagine that only one of you can live, and it is your decision who." Powder wiped the blood dripping from her nose and nodded. She stared at Sevika and searched her mind for the anger that would drive her. The dark-skinned, dark-haired woman disappeared, and in her place stood pink-haired Vi, smirking down at Powder. Powder's temper flared at the sight of her sister. She screamed like a wild animal and lunged at Sevika, her tiny fists clenched. Before Sevika could react, Powder had climbed up her body and smashed her fists into the woman's face. Sevika's look of surprise turned to frustration, and she tore Powder away and threw her to the ground. Powder rolled away from the kick aimed at her and snarled, then lunged again, sinking her teeth into Sevika's leg. Sevika cried out and launched her fist at Powder's face. Powder ignored the blow and continued to clamp her teeth onto Sevika's flesh. She was grinning manically. "That's enough," said Silco, smiling with pride. Powder did not release her bite. "Little one, I said that's enough." Still she ignored him. Sevika had had enough. She raised her free leg behind her and drove her knee into the side of Powder's head. Powder flew several meters away and landed heavily. She stopped moving. Silco rushed to her and placed his hand on her back. She was shaking. At first he thought she was crying, then he realized the sound coming from her was laughter. It began as a high-pitched, girlish chuckle, then gradually rose in intensity until she was howling, the sound bouncing off the walls and back to her. Her mouth dripped with Sevika's blood, and she did not bother to clear it. "Good," said Silco, patting her shoulder. "Good, my little Jinx." Powder kept laughing until she ran out of air. No, not Powder. Powder was dead. She was Jinx now. Miles away, on an island off the coast of Zorn, 2 prison guards shoved Vi into a cell. The current occupant, her new cellmate, rose from his bed when he saw her. His bulging muscles stretched his prison suit at his arms and chest. "Well," he said, as the guards slammed and locked the door behind them, "aren't you a pretty one? We're going to have some fun, little lady." Vi showed her teeth and cracked her knuckles. "You have no idea." The prison guards were halfway to their office when they heard the screams of a man coming from the cell they had just left.
I am the monster you created. You ripped out all my parts. And worst of all, for me to live, I gotta kill the part of me that saw